In this recording, we'll discuss an introduction to the central nervous system. Your central nervous system, or your CNS, includes both your brain and your spinal cord. These organs are involved in movement, interpreting sensory information, assisting with maintaining homeostasis, and other functions relating to the mind. So think of things like learning, memory, language, all that good stuff. Now, your nervous system in general, we can break it down into three different categories. We have sensory functions. Your peripheral nervous system, or your PNS, is responsible for detecting sensations both inside and outside the body, so internal and external stimuli. These sensory information signals make their way to your central nervous system, your CNS again, where we're going to do some integrative functions. Okay? These include decision-making processes that only your central nervous system can accomplish. These include things like interpreting the sensory information that they just received, planning and monitoring movements in response to the sensory information, maintaining homeostasis, and again, higher mental functions like language and learning. Now, what are we integrating really? What are we decision making, okay, for? We're doing that in response to the sensory information that we just gathered, okay? Once your brain and your spinal cord, once your central nervous system decides what to do about that sensory information, we send signals through your motor function division, which is also your peripheral nervous system. We're going to send those signals to your muscle cells for contraction, to your glands for secretion, things like that. Why are we doing these motor functions? Again, it's ultimately in response to the sensory information that we detected, and we processed that information in your central nervous system and determined we needed some sort of motor output. Now, your brain is soft and whitish and grayish all at the same time. It's kind of squishy, it's wrinkly, it looks kind of icky in this picture. It looks kind of wet almost in this picture because of those meninges. But that's okay. This is your giant noodle nut, y'all. This is where all the good stuff happens. This is continuous with the spinal cord, even though we kind of cut it off in this picture. So your spinal cord would continue down here. You already know that your brain resides in your cranial cavity within your skull. And your brain is pretty much in charge of like everything, both directly or indirectly, controlling most of your body functions. Now, if we were to chop this brain in half and look inside, we would notice that there are cavities. These are called ventricles within the brain, and these are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, CSF. Okay? Now, your brain is kind of greedy. It receives about 20% of your blood flow during rest. So it's literally just you sitting there watching and listening to this video. Your brain is getting 20% of your blood flow, which reflects how much oxygen and glucose and other nutrients your brain requires just to keep you alive. So again, your brain's kind of greedy, but your brain's kind of a big deal, and so we just let it happen. Now, we can subdivide your brain into four basic regions or divisions. We've got your cerebrum, which is the large part of your brain that you probably think of when you think of brain. The very internal middle portion is your diencephalon. You've got this lower region that sits right up under your cerebrum. This is your cerebellum. And then continuous with the diencephalon would be your brain stem, which in and of itself is continuous with the spinal cord. And it's not going to shock you to learn. We're going to go through each one of these one at a time. So the cerebrum, again, it's the larger part, the outermost part, the wrinkly part. This includes both your gray matter, which is your cerebral cortex, the white matter, and your basal nuclei. We do divide your cerebrum into hemispheres. You have a left and right cerebral hemisphere. And each of these hemispheres is then subdivided into 5 lobes. You've got frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital. Those should definitely sound familiar since you have frontal bone, temporal bone, etc. That 5th lobe, that is your insula. Okay, now that one doesn't get a bone name, right? There's no insula bone. This one is a little harder to see because your insula is deep inside the cerebrum. So these other 4, frontal, temporal, etc., you can see those from the outside. if you want to see the insula, we got to cut into the brain. Okay, so don't forget about it. It's in there. All right, you just got to look a little harder to find it. Now, the neurons within these lobes perform specific tasks. Okay, and we'll go through each lobe at a time here in a minute. Some of, not all of, but some of the functions of the cerebrum include both your consciousness, so being aware of your surroundings, perception of the world around you, being able to communicate both internally and externally. Okay, so your body has to be able to communicate with itself, and then we need to be able to communicate with things in our environment, understanding of what's happening in your environment, and voluntary movement. Okay. Your cerebrum contains interneurons for both motor, sensory, and integrative functioning. And this is where we do that decision making that we talked about a couple of slides ago. All right, so we mentioned gray matter a second ago. Let's make sure we remember what gray matter is. First of all, the cerebral gray matter, your cerebral cortex, it's only about 1/8 of an inch thick. And so in this image, it's kind of a grayish, almost bluish shade to it, but you can see the interior portion is a much lighter color. This would be that white matter we'll get to here in just a second. So the gray matter is just along the outside. Okay. Again, this is referred to also as your cerebral cortex, so in case you see that term thrown around. You also have a couple of deeper pockets of gray matter within the brain. So we call these basal nuclei. Okay, we'll come back to those here in a minute as well. But you do have little tiny portions of gray matter dotted on the inside as well. Now we said the brain is wrinkly. Okay, we call these raised hills or these wrinkles. One individual is a gyrus. Okay, if you are referring to them collectively or in multiples, they are gyri. So G-Y-R-I would be plural. Okay. And in between each raised hill or each wrinkle, you get a little groove. So we've got a wrinkle and a groove. We've got a wrinkle and a groove. We've got a wrinkle and a groove. These grooves or valleys, these are individually called a sulcus. Okay. Collectively or in multiples, these are called sulci. Okay, so gyri and sulci are plural. Okay. This pattern, hills and valleys, allow us to increase the surface area of our brains. The more surface area, the more brain we can pack inside that cranial cavity, the more neurons we can have, the smarter we can be, the more things we can do. Now, we do have two really large, deep grooves. These are called fissures. Okay, we've got one right now in the center. This is your longitudinal fissure. Okay, this separates your left and right cerebral hemispheres. Okay, so we can literally chop your brain in half, basically. And then you have a transverse fissure that separates the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Now, we can't see that in this picture. Let me see. Where is... Oh, haha. Okay, so we've got your cerebrum, and we'll go back, I promise. This is your cerebrum. Remember, this is your cerebellum. This dividing line right here, okay, that's not labeled on this picture, but this dividing line, that would be your transverse fissure. Okay, this line right here would be your longitudinal fissure. So your longitudinal separates lefts and rights. Okay, your transverse separates your cerebrum and your cerebellum. Okay, so now you kind of got an idea of what that looks like. All right, now last thing on this slide, ventricles. Okay, so we mentioned that the interior region of your brain has these cavities that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, your cerebral hemispheres specifically surround your lateral ventricles. Okay, and since this is just a section of brain, you can see the space. Okay, right here. You've got one on each side. You have other ventricles to speak of, and we'll come back to those, but these are just really easy to spot. And again, they're surrounded by the gray matter, or well, the gray and white matter of your cerebral hemispheres. All right, so that gray matter. You may or may not remember that the gray matter means that we're not finding any myelin. Okay, remember we talked about myelin sheaths a little bit ago. The gray matter is all neurons of the cortex being interneurons. They're all interneurons. So they are helping connect your sensory and your motor functions of your nervous system. Okay, this also includes the integration function, so deciding what to do with the sensory information. Do we need a motor output or not? Okay. The other major jobs of your cerebral cortex, besides movement, is, again, this is where we get our consciousness, perception, communication, understanding. All the things that we associate with being human. Okay, that all happens in your cortex. But then we do have voluntary movement occurring here as well. We do have specific regions of the brain. These are known as Brodmann areas. These are the very specific regions of the brain that have very, very specific functions. So you have a speech area, you have a hearing area, you have a primary motor area, etc. And you can see we've got quite a few. Okay, and in this picture you can kind of see what some of these regions are associated with. So we've got little numbers over here, but this kind of is a little bit more helpful, showing us what is going on where. And we're going to talk about several of these. Okay, but before we do, let's not forget that your brain also has white matter. This is located in the interior portion of the cerebrum. Okay. Remember, if it's white matter, we are finding myelin, and since this is the central nervous system, the myelin's coming from your oligodendrocytes. Okay. We have 3 types of fibers, okay, neuron fibers that assist us with communication, okay, both within the brain and then between the brain and other parts of the body. We've got association fibers. Okay. These help connect areas of the cortex within a single hemisphere. Okay, so these run the length of the brain anterior to posterior, so front to back. Okay, these are going to run front to back, and so these red ones, for example, okay, we are going to have these red fibers run front to back on the left side, and then we'd also see the same thing on the right side also. Okay. Commissural fibers let us talk left brain to right brain, so left to right hemispheres. Okay, so for example, okay, these that are running side to side, these that are running side to side. This does include your corpus callosum, which is probably one of the largest set of commissural fibers that you have. Okay, again, these green ones up here running left to right. These are commissural fibers. Again, what are we doing with commissural fibers? We're connecting left brain and right brain. Okay. Association fibers, we're connecting front of the brain to the back of the brain. Commissural are connecting left brain to right brain. Now, last but not least, projection fibers. These are connecting the cerebral cortex with the rest of the brain. Okay, so for example, we could need to carry information from your cortex to your cerebellum. Okay, we could need to talk between your cerebral cortex and your diencephalon, something like that. That's what projection fibers are used for, and that would be these really long purple ones. You can see they run through the diencephalon area, they run through the brainstem area. Okay. So we've got lots of fibers running in all kinds of different directions, but at the very least, we can all agree that your brain is very well connected, which is probably a good thing.